So important, of course, sitting here in London, but for the continent of Europe as well, as we watch to see how that conflict unfolds. And ultimately, of course, the durability of US support. What did we learn from both these candidates in terms of how durable that US support is likely to be in the future?
Well, it couldn't be more different in that you start with President Biden really kind of pushing back against President Trump's kind of refusal to support Ukraine. He actively said that, or support NATO, I should be more specific, actively said that he had an off-the-record conversation apparently years ago that insinuated that where he threatened to pull the NATO spending, and it was followed by Europeans spending billions. That's the verbatim, or at least the claim that he makes. President Biden pushing back against that and saying, would you like to leave NATO altogether and leave Ukraine to Putin, and not just the disputed territories in the east of Ukraine, but the entire country, to which President Trump said if the war was then done, could potentially be done before he's even inaugurated, if he indeed is elected. Lots of claims being made, but at the end of it, he's using that NATO spend as a reason for one, being kind of perhaps a little bit removed from the situation, highlighting the fact that there's an ocean between Europe and the United States, but also saying that NATO spend can help fund the deficit. So he's using this NATO story as more than just a defense story.
Well, let's take a listen to what both candidates had to say on NATO.
We have an ocean separating us. The European nations together have spent $100 billion, or maybe more than that, less than us. Why doesn't he call them and say, you got to put up your money like I did with NATO? I got them to put up hundreds of billions of dollars. You got to ask these people to put up the money. We're over $100 billion more spent, and it has a bigger impact on them because of location, because we have an ocean in between.
I've never heard so much foolishness. This is a guy who wants to get out of NATO. You're going to stay in NATO? He's going to pull out of NATO. It may be a big ocean, but were we ever able to avoid a war in Europe, a major war in Europe? What happens if, in fact, you have Putin continue to go into NATO? We have an Article 5 agreement. Attack on one is attack on all.
OK, so comments there on NATO, comments there on support for Ukraine. The other issue, of course, geopolitically, that will be central to whoever takes office and continue to be central is what's happening with China. Do we get clarity on their stance when it comes to China? And also the question of tariffs.
We got something. I'm not sure if clarity is the right word to describe it. President Trump, of course, talking about the fact that he wants to be tough on China. This is not a surprise. Both presidents have talked about creating an equal playing field. The approach is a little bit different here. Again, this is coming back to that deficit spend story where he's saying tariffs on China could help kind of close the gap on the spending story in the States. He didn't really go into what the tariff picture would actually look like in a Trump 2.0. He did talk about the 10% tariffs, to which President Biden
Which is across the board.
Correct. And also sort of already exists in various industries as well in the state. So how much of that changes, we don't know. But we do know in previous interviews with Fox News, for example, he's threatened as high as 60%. On that front, we didn't get much clarity. President Biden really pushing back and saying, as much as we do have to get tough on China, it also becomes an inflationary story. That is the extent of where they went on China, which is surprising given, especially for an international audience and the two largest economies in the world, it was more of a pivot point. Critics of that would say their policies on China aren't actually that different because at the end of the day, in Biden's first term, he didn't actually remove any of the policies. President Trump saying that's because the funding is simply too big to move.
Yeah, some Democrats critiqued, didn't they, the detail and the imposition of tariffs on China to the extent that they came through from the Trump administration, but they have not been rolled back, to your point. But other China analysts would also say that, in fact, the Biden administration has taken a tougher line in terms of particularly the restrictions on technology and key technology. So that's on China, and we touched on Ukraine. This is the policy, and this is where you get into the details, and this is really, really important. But there's also a question of style as well as substance, Kritty. And some of the headlines today, the focus on the stumbles, the missteps coming through from Biden, but also the mistruths, the lies, frankly, from former President Trump. Talk us through what we heard and what we take away in terms of how the positioning is, the imagery, the symbolism, and how this cuts through to voters.
Well, this was a real test for both presidents. And remember, it's important that the debate structure is noted here because this was 90 minutes of standing. They had pen, paper, water, no consultations with their debate teams or campaigns, muted microphones. And they really had, it was a test of endurance for President Trump, who is 78 years old, and President Biden, who, of course, is 81 years old. They talked about their mental stamina, their mental competence, which resulted in a very interesting conversation about how they both both do at golf and taking their physicals in the White House during their respective first terms. That being said, from an international perspective, and I think what needs to be said is as soon as the debate ended, there was panic among the Democratic Party. And you saw reports from a lot of various American media channels saying there is now concern of whether or not Biden's performance in this debate or lack thereof of energy created.
Who do they go to if they have to change candidate? I mean, how realistic is that right now?
Well, that's the concern, because on the other side, to balance this conversation out, you did have plenty of falsehoods, to your point. And again, in this debate, there was no live fact-checking by CNN to really keep the integrity of the quick, snappy answers and make it a civilized discourse. So things like former President Trump, talking about the definition of abortion with Roe v. Wade, President Trump talking about whether or not riots in Charlottesville, which really instigated or is seen as the instigation of the broader kind of far-right movements, and eventually the Capitol riots as well. He's saying that really wasn't one of the starting points. He even debates his own role, of course, in the Capitol riot, saying that this was a civilized and even patriotic thing. So again, a lot of things that weren't fact-checked in the moment, but in retrospect, to your point, a lot of independents who aren't diehard fans of either candidate are really struggling here with these two choices.